All right, it's 1:13 a.m. The lights didn't go out. Maybe that was the problem. At a regional water systems facility, operators watch their screens stay steady. The flow, steady. Pressure, fantastic, perfectly in line. No indicators were popping, nothing showing red. Perfect night, maybe too perfect. 4 miles away, a chlorine pump spun 9% faster than a safety limit. Not enough to trigger alarms, of course, just enough to poison lungs. A breaker hesitated for 300 milliseconds. That's it, which is considered too short for a fault, according to the latest published playbook that was developed by the team 6 months prior. But long enough to desynchronize the system, the systems began to heat, but they began to heat quietly. A generator controller accepted a firmware update it never asked for. The checksum matched, the signature was valid, the attacker stole it months ago and waited very patiently. 1:19, dispatchers received the first call. The water tastes like metal. 1:21, systems began to freeze up. And at 1:23, the purification system corrected itself the wrong way. Only then did the dashboard alarms begin to sound. By the time the SOC team and the engineers realized the systems were manic, bouncing all over the place, the attacker was done. No ransomware, no demand, no noise, just total disruption. Just a little message that was buried in a random server log file. It said, "This is a test. Next time it won't be." But the lights, they were still on. Welcome, everybody, to the Zero Trust Issues podcast. It's good to have you again. I'm Tony Pietrocola, my co-founder and co-host, Joe Marquette. That was an actual test done at a regional water facility, which will remain nameless, and obviously that water facility froze up. So today we're going to talk about critical infrastructure, cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. Obviously, it's beyond words to say how important it is. And joining us is Major General retired Ryan Heritage. Ryan, welcome, and thank you so much for giving us 20 minutes today.
Thanks, Tony, Joe. Yeah, pleasure to be here, and look forward to the discussion. It was a good opening. Got the heart going.
Scary opening.
Got the heart going. That's right.
So you got my heartbeat going, Tony. I don't know about anybody else, but
hey, we're not smart enough to have a great podcast in terms of exactly what people are expecting without that story. I think that story kind of frames it up, and now we can kind of talk about some of our expertise. So let me give you the Major General's background, and then we'll dive in. So Ryan P. Heritage is a retired Marine Corps Major General, Director of Operations, United States Cyber Command. Commissioned via the Naval ROTC after graduating from George Washington University in 1990. Infantry officer. I'd love to hear how an infantry officer became Cyber Command in a career with extraordinarily roles. Transitioned into cyber and future operations roles at U.S. Cyber Command. Commanded the Marine Corps Forces Cyberspace and Information Command with Lieutenant General and assignment as Deputy Commander for Information before moving over to the J3 at Cyber. Tremendous background, Major General, and this is why we're so excited to have you today. I know you're working on a lot of great things yourself, but today's about critical infrastructure. I guess everybody thinks everything's critical nowadays, even someone who owns a small business, because it's critical to them. But water, electricity, the grid, data, missile systems, I mean, everything's critical infrastructure these days. So why don't we dive in? I know Joe has some really interesting thoughts and questions to get this thing started as well. So why don't I kick it over to Joe and let's dive in.
it sounds great. Major General, first of all, thank you for your service. And man, we really are excited to have you here today. So we appreciate your time. As Tony alluded to, I'm curious how things started for you. You began your career leading Marines in the infantry. I got to believe that you get a lot of training and education and indoctrination into visible threats, immediate threats, physical threats. And at some point along the line, you switch over and now you're driving cyber operations where the enemy is probably a lot less visible and persistent, ambiguous. You know, how does that transition happen? And what was there anything that carried over cleanly, or what? And was there anything that you had to essentially unlearn in tackling this the new threat that you were in charge of now?
Thanks, Tony, first for the introduction, and Joe for great questions to start off. I'm asked that quite frequently. How did you land in this space? 20 plus years as an infantry officer, from second lieutenant up to colonel, leading battalions. For 25 plus years, learned about maneuver warfare and combined arms, where you're taking different platforms, taking systems that are really complementary, integrating them in support of a mission you've been given or somebody else's mission, where you're integrating again different capabilities, different platforms, different people, different services, authorities, and that sort of thing. So that did, I think, in a lot of ways shape how I looked at the cyber domain and the space domain, and really the entire information environment. So after my colonel command, I was brought into the cyber domain by then Brigadier General Vince Stewart, a mentor for so many across the Marine Corps, really an expert in the intel field, and then into the cyber domain himself. And he brought me in there, and really that's where it started, and that's where it ended. And so the last 15 years have been in and out of Cyber Command and Marine Forces Cyber Command. And in 2018, I took the helm at Marine Forces Cyberspace Command. At the same time, I won't say we stood up, but we really got Marine Forces Space Command really on the map and moving forward. And shortly thereafter, we stood up a third command, the Marine Corps Information Command. And I say that because it was an opportunity for an operational commander to really, I'll say, leverage a lot of what I'd learned as an infantry by taking different capabilities from the cyber domain, the space domain, and the information domain, put those together, leverage different authorities that I was given from different bosses, and put them in support of whether it's the Marine Corps or the Joint Force globally. And so, when we look at, or when I look at the cyber domain, for me, it's maneuver space. It's not only maneuver space, something where we're maneuvering through, but also maneuvering against persistent engagement. It is a contested space, but the cyber domain was also a weapons platform, something from which you project power, but also, when you think about the data, it's something you have to protect at all costs. Think about decision advantage in the cyber domain. How do you protect that data and enable the commander who's forward to be able to make the right decision ahead of an adversary at the right time and place of their choosing, by thinking everything from critical infrastructure to that data transport and how that's being transported in time. So I like to think everything that I learned as an infantry officer, I was able to apply in the cyber and space domains, particularly through a maneuverist sort of mindset, if that makes sense.
Let me throw something out, Major General. Recently, and you probably saw in the news, if we watch the news, we see these things, but Waymo's bricked the other day, right? So self-driving cars bricked in San Francisco. About a month and a half ago, AWS went down in Virginia. Of course, I think they said it was a faulty patch or something like that. When you think about the critical infrastructure of the next generation, you mentioned space, self-driving autonomous cars, data centers that keep everything going. Without a data center, we wouldn't be on right now. Does that job of critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, defense, does it just seem daunting? Like, does it seem like, my goodness, this job is incredibly complex? Yeah, is it possible?
Yeah, I think, again, great. I think we have to deliberately review the definition of critical infrastructure. And obviously I look through a lens of, Department of War sort of thing is my primary lens. And so you think about defense critical infrastructure, that in itself, I think, is also changing based on the dependencies, relationships that the Department of War has with private public industry in support of its mission. So I think a couple things. One, it is, I don't want to say it's the wicked problem, unsolvable problem, but it's certainly complex and ever changing, right? It's the only, from a warfighting perspective, it's the only man-made warfighting domain. And so, it is going to be constantly changing. You have to be comfortable in the uncertainty that is inherent in that domain. But I think because of technology, you can leverage it to cut down, mitigate a lot of that uncertainty, and hopefully, address and make it as certain, as clear as possible. So I think, both the adversary and defenders will be full speed ahead in trying to leverage that technology to their advantage. And the dependency too, when we talk about, in the past, I think there was a clear line between, military and civilian when you think in crisis and conflict. But I think that those lines are graying now because of those dependencies. Everything's connected, right? Cyber doesn't recognize borders and laws necessarily, right? We're trying to constantly define the cyber domain and rules or norms of behavior, but when there's no clear borders, it can certainly drive up the uncertainty.
Well, as a quick follow-on to that, the infrastructure that, the directions that you're referring to, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. If you were speaking to leaders today, government, city, elected officials, and there's got to be a lot of ambiguity between just the fragility of these infrastructures and versus actually malicious attacks. They all look the same probably to the voter, if you will. But how do you focus on, what would you advise people focus on? You can't fix everything. Where do you focus first? How do you sort of prioritize?
I think first it starts with a strategy. And I know the folks in Washington, this administration is getting after it. A national strategy for cybersecurity and state. So how to, just in clear language, how do we define secure infrastructure? Is there a good enough? Is it, something beyond just no disruptions? To your point on, hey, the lights were on, but everything behind the lights, behind the scenes was not really functioning the way it should have. So I think it starts with a strategy at the national level. And then I think that sort of waterfall effect down to the state and local level. And we have to figure a way to integrate those strategies and both from top down and then bottom up. And I think from a policy and processes perspective, the information or intel sharing, we have to find a way in which that becomes the norm. Just like you had in the opening, a cyber sort of cybersecurity incident in one town likely does have a relationship with the town over or the town on the other side of the country. And so how are we sharing that sort of threat intelligence real time? And so the policy and processes need to be in place to allow it. I'm not asking for more bureaucracy by any means, but a process that incentivizes everything from the small startup or small owner company, incentivizes them to have the right cybersecurity. But also there's got to be some sort of, say, leverage. There's got to be some way to compel that cybersecurity because it's so interconnected. Again, redefining what critical infrastructure is. We just have to recognize the threat exists. It's not that the threat is coming. The threat exists today. And so how do we address the vulnerabilities that we have today? How do you bring in new solutions from these startups that address legacy infrastructure? How do we address or I think it was Jen Easterly wrote a very good article on software development and holding software developers sort of a sense of incentivizing, but also holding accountable, right, for those vulnerabilities. So, if I'm sitting on one side of the table and I'm putting out my requirement, I'm asking for a solution, right, immediately. I'm not saying here's my requirement and come back 9 months from now with a solution. That's not sufficient because the domain is changing too quick. Show up with a solution that we can constantly iterate on, that's easily integrated to the other systems that I have, and addresses everything from my ability to continue to modernize my systems, but also addresses the legacy, the tech debt that I have that I know I won't get out of, all at the same time. That's what I think that's a step in the right approach. And you mentioned state and local. So I've been there's three legs of the stool that I think are really important once you have that strategy. It's the government, and I'll call federal, state, and local. It's academia in there, but private, public, at all different echelons, and then there's private industry. Being able to leverage and those at scale, that's our competitive advantage. Being able to put.
Just as a quick follow-up, and I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt. How would you grade, rank, discuss? Are we keeping up with the increasing threats, or is it at the state, federal, local, education, business side, or how do you see the landscape and our ability to keep up with the increasing threat profiles?
I wouldn't say we're falling behind, right? But I would say it is a peer-to-peer competition. I get asked a question about artificial intelligence and offense. Does it advantage the attacker versus the defender? I think right now, artificial intelligence is an advantage for the attacker. I think that defenders are catching up. We're not catching up at scale like we need to. And for an attacker, there's a whole different risk calculus. They just have to be lucky once, and they can leverage that tech debt, right? They can leverage the vulnerabilities across the whole breadth of cyber landscape. I think CrowdStrike put out their annual report, and if I get this right, it was 48 minutes is the average time in 2024 for lateral movement once initial penetration. And so when you think about your small companies to major industrial complexes, their abilities of their SOC to identify it, right? Do they have the systems online at the edge that are identifying that immediately and then remediating? So I think we are closing the gap from a defender perspective, leveraging that technology, but it is certainly a race.
Major General, just to build off that, do you think that is something, you mentioned tech debt now a few times. You mentioned holding the software developers potentially responsible, right? Do you think that's something Congress would potentially take up? Because that's a pretty big lift right there on that liability.
Yeah, and I said policy process that I probably should have thrown in, law in there as well. I do. I think there's, and it doesn't, whether it's hold accountable or incentivize, right? Those are, I think, again, if we're looking to scale, you're going to have to incentivize folks that, the smaller companies that just can't afford it right off the bat, but incentivize that development. And it's not just for the software's hardware, firmware, right? It's moving so fast that if we don't pay the keen eye to it, you're going to continue to fight the battle of vulnerabilities and 0 days on, right from the get-go. And that's not a position we want to be in.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I know we don't want to take up, we want to keep ourselves right in the framework of our time. I'm curious at this point, if there's any one thing that you see either business or government leaders, mistakes that they make even repeatedly, thinking that they're prepared to defend infrastructure, and even though they're not. Is there any single thing that people want to make sure that they watch out for? Any assumptions that we should be holding people to being aware of at least?
I don't want to sound like an alarmist. I think a realist is understanding, again, that the threat exists. That just because you don't have a disruption doesn't mean that you don't have a vulnerability that's been exploited. And so how do you find that? The recent reporting on the typhoon series, right? The Volt typhoons in there, I think it came out in 24, and then later reporting stated that they'd been in there. The Chinese have been in the telecommunications globally and other systems since 2019. And how do you discover that? How do you then stay ahead of that? How do you clean them out? And then how do you stay ahead of that? So I think you need a constant review of your assumptions that are related to your security. I think you need a constant review of the threat and who you're sharing it with, who you're partnering with to understand and get the latest intel. I think constant review of your priorities, and those priorities like the investment. I still hear from folks where the CISO is not sitting in the C-suite discussions, right? I think they should. On the Marine Corps side, we used to call it the intel was known as the S2 or the G2 or J2. Then the operations was the 3, the J3, the G3, S3, and the communications officer, the S6, G6 or J6. I'm like, for me, it's always that integration between your 2, your 3, and your 6, your intel, your ops, and your communications, and making sure that they understand the commander's priorities. They understand the threat. They're seeing things very similarly, so that they can provide that best guidance or recommendations to the commander. I think you can take that same sort of analogy and apply it to business today.
I thought that first thing you said was really interesting, because you said challenge your assumptions. And almost everything I heard you say after that was really about going back, and it kind of started with all those assumptions. Is this now the priority? Are you defending? Like, what's the new, like, all your assumptions just have to be on rinse and repeat, right?
Absolutely. I think, every company's going to have a mission statement, right? This is, this is their purpose. Constantly reviewing those assumptions that support that mission statement. And when they change, then I think you have to review your mission statement overall.
It's great. Major General, that was fantastic. We always end with one big takeaway. I think what you just said, that was a fantastic takeaway. I'm not so certain in your lingo, the J6, the G this and the C that. I can't even attempt to catch up with that. But in business, I will tell you that CEOs and potentially CIOs and the team might not always be in sync with the plans that they've laid out, the playbooks they've laid out. And I think from the example I illustrated at the water department, that's a playbook issue right there that really came to light a little too late. Thank God it was a test. Thank God the water didn't taste like metal. But I think you see that all the way. So I think your takeaway is fantastic for critical infrastructure, obviously military, and business extraordinarily. So we really, really appreciate that. Joe, any final takeaways on your end?
No, I think that last segment there really hit home for me. I love it.
Pounded it home. Major General, it's great to talk to you. Enjoy your Christmas and your New Year's with your family, and thanks for joining Joe and I on this podcast. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Tony. Joe. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks very much, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Absolutely. And for more information on AgileBlue, just check it out, agileblue.com.
Thanks for tuning in to Zero Trust Issues. Be sure to click follow so you never miss an episode. And visit AgileBlue.com to learn more about how AI-native cybersecurity can protect your business. The information shared in this podcast represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily reflect those of AgileBlue. This content is provided for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as professional cybersecurity, legal, or business advice. Always consult qualified professionals regarding your organization's specific needs or circumstances.